Welcome back, it's Professor Marinos, and today we're going to jump into the nitrogen cycle, which is probably the best elemental cycle. Carbon gives it a run for its money, but I like the nitrogen cycle. It's a good cycle. And we're going to discuss how nitrogen moves around on land and how biota dominate the movement of nitrogen on land. So we'll just get into this. By the end of this lesson, I want you to be able to outline the major steps in the nitrogen cycle, identify why nitrogen can be in short supply despite it being all around us in the atmosphere, and finally describe the processes that lead to nitrogen loss from terrestrial ecosystems. So to get into this, nitrogen limitation on land is widespread. There are many biomes across the globe that are nitrogen limited. Most temperate forests are nitrogen limited, most boreal forests are nitrogen limited, grasslands tend to be nitrogen limited, and even dry tropical ecosystems also tend to be nitrogen limited. Now, why is this? Well, the other contender for major elemental limitation, phosphorus, tends to be in relatively higher supply in these sorts of ecosystems because there's lots of relatively unweathered minerals that can supply phosphorus. Apatite is the major source of phosphorus from geologic sources. And in many of these ecosystems, there tends to be a good bit of phosphorus hanging around that plants and other organisms can utilize. It's only when you get into really old ecosystems, old highly weathered ecosystems, such as this tropical rainforest here, that you tend to see phosphorus limitation. These soils have been weathered. They might be like 20, 30 meters deep. There's probably just aluminum and iron oxyhydroxides remaining in the soil. Most all of the apatite has already been stripped out of the soil. There's very little phosphorus in tropical environments. And so tropical rainforests, as a rule, tend to be phosphorus limited, but most other biomes on the face of the Earth, terrestrial biomes that is, tend to be nitrogen limited. There are always exceptions to this, of course, but nitrogen limitation is a general tendency across the land surface. But why is this? It's pretty counterintuitive because our atmosphere, as you well know, is 78% nitrogen. So how can there be nitrogen all around us? We breathe it in and out every time we take a breath. Yet we still have to resort to fertilizing our agricultural fields with tons of nitrogen every year. What accounts for this discrepancy? Well, the answer to this question lies in the structure of diatomic nitrogen, shown here. This is nitrogen bonded to nitrogen, N2 gas. And N2 gas has this extremely strong triple bond here. You'll see that nitrogen shares 3 electrons with the other nitrogen. And this bond is extremely hard to break. And as a result, this nitrogen, the nitrogen that we breathe in and out, is very non-reactive. It's almost inert. And so in order to transform this inert dinitrogen gas into plant-usable forms and organismally usable forms, you have to break these bonds and assemble it into other molecules that are more reactive, such as ammonium or nitrate are the 2 major inorganic forms of nitrogen that you find in the environment that are usable by organisms. So organisms can take up ammonium, and they can also take up nitrate. They can't take up dinitrogen gas and turn it into plant tissues or organismal tissues. And the process by which organisms turn dinitrogen gas into these usable forms is called nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is the conversion of dinitrogen gas into biologically available forms. The first form is nitrate, or ammonium, but this ammonium can later be turned into nitrate. And it proceeds by this reaction. 2 nitrogens plus 3 hydrogens yields 2 ammonias, which can then dissolve into solution and protonate to form ammonium. And you'll notice, actually, that this is thermodynamically favorable. Under standard conditions, it is an exergonic reaction. This is a reaction that will proceed in the forward direction under standard conditions. And there's very little ammonia gas in the atmosphere. There's tons of nitrogen and some hydrogen. So you'd expect this reaction to proceed in the forward direction. But this is a good example of where thermodynamic equilibria does not line up with the state of the environment due to very slow kinetics. This reaction happens so slowly because this bond is so very difficult to break in this dinitrogen that you actually never reach equilibrium. You never reach this the state of production of ammonia in the atmosphere because this reaction proceeds incredibly slowly. Breaking that bond has such high activation energy that you produce almost no ammonia in the atmosphere abiotically. The way that you do produce ammonia in the atmosphere abiotically is through lightning. So for the first 2 billion years of the Earth existing, the only biologically available nitrogen that was produced by lightning, just jolting a ton of energy into the atmosphere and combining hydrogen and nitrogen into ammonia gas. Then about 2 billion years ago or so, some microbes figured out how to do this. And so this is the essence of biological nitrogen fixation. These microbes figured out how to make enzymes, very, very complicated and expensive enzymes to make. It takes a lot of energy to make these enzymes. But they figured out how to produce nitrogen, and this was a huge boon for life. Previously, if you're only relying on the chance of lightning to produce your nitrogen, you had a really hard go of getting nitrogen. But these organisms really had it made in the shade when they figured out how to make nitrogen themselves. And this nitrogen fixation happens in these tiny little cells. This is a colonial algae here. And these tiny little black dots that you can see kind of poking around here, these are what are called heterocysts. And these are non-photosynthetic cells in this multi-strand algae that produce ammonium via the incorporation of nitrogen gas. And it gets all the energy to do this from all the sugars that these photosynthetic cells over here are producing. And it takes a lot of energy to fix nitrogen because these enzymes that catalyze the production of ammonium from dinitrogen gas, like I said, are very, very difficult and expensive to make metabolically. So 2 billion years ago, the nitrogen economy really loosened up. Microbes are feeling good. They could produce nitrogen all by themselves. And growth of organisms took off as a result, and everybody was happy, I guess. And for the first 4.5 billion years on Earth, these were the only two ways that nitrogen entered into the Earth, either through nitrogen fixing bacteria or through lightning. Then, 100 years ago, everything changed. Two German chemists, Haber and Bosch, figured out a crazy, convoluted Rube Goldberg-esque process to create fixed nitrogen from nitrogen gas. And this reaction just involves the same reaction that's occurring here. It's just combining nitrogen gas with hydrogen gas to form ammonia, just in a reactor that can do it very, very efficiently at reasonable temperatures, not the temperature inside a lightning strike, but at, I think, 500 degrees Celsius. And this was huge. This now results in over 33% of all the world's nitrogen that's fixed any year is fixed by this Haber-Bosch process. And this ignited what's called the Green Revolution across the Earth. All of a sudden, this nitrogen alleviated major food shortage issues. We started producing tons more crops. We started feeding people a lot better and a lot more. And as a result, it caused a huge population boom in the 1900s. People call the Haber-Bosch process the trigger that ignited the population explosion. And that is absolutely true. So with the Haber-Bosch process, better living through chemistry, as DuPont would have you believe, we created a ton more food in the world. We increased agricultural productivity a ton, but we also have now a ton of nutrient pollution issues as a result of a 33% increase in nitrogen supply due to organic fertilizers. This is also a huge use of carbon. I believe that the Haber-Bosch process accounts for like 1 or 2% of all the methane that's used in the world every year. It might even be a little bit higher than that. I'm not sure on those numbers, but it's definitely a very appreciable amount of energy that is produced in the world goes towards fixing nitrogen through this Haber-Bosch process to make fertilizers. So we now have 3 ways that nitrogen can get into a system via fixation. We have lightning fixation, which is now a minuscule amount of nitrogen compared to the other sources. We have natural fixation by bacteria, biological nitrogen fixation, and we have this anthropogenic source, the Haber-Bosch process. So this is a diagram of the terrestrial nitrogen cycle that I'm going to keep returning to in this lecture, and we've just discussed this component here, nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation can happen by just microbes that are hanging out living in the soil by themselves. They can fix nitrogen. It can also happen by microbes that have symbioses with plants. This is the case with beans and peas and peanuts. All legumes, or most legumes, form these symbioses with nitrogen-fixing bacteria such that they can supply their own nitrogen fertilizer to these plants. And not illustrated on this figure, but super important, is fertilization by humans with inorganic nitrogen fertilizer that contributes in total to the sum amount of nitrogen entering into an ecosystem. So this is the input term here, this fixation term that happens on this side of this diagram. So what happens after nitrogen's fixed? Well, after nitrogen's fixed, plants and organisms assimilate it. Assimilation is the process of the conversion of inorganic forms of nitrogen, such as ammonium and nitrate, into organic molecules by plants and microbes. So plants and microbes take in ammonium, they take in nitrate, and through catabolic reactions in their cells, they turn these into organic tissues, like proteins. Proteins are incredibly nitrogen-rich substances. Proteins are made up of amino acids. Amine groups are nitrogen-containing groups. And so plants assimilate nitrogen into their tissues via these reactions. These are kind of generalized reactions. They don't have a Gibbs free energy associated with them because this is a vague term. But it's just conversion of inorganic forms of nitrogen, shown here, into organic forms. So that is this area here. Plants, decomposers, they all, and just microbes in general, all assimilate nitrogen from the environment into their tissues. Decomposers can either assimilate organic nitrogen coming from plant sources, or they can also assimilate inorganic sources. So this is the next step in the nitrogen cycle, assimilation of fixed nitrogen into tissues. After this assimilation occurs, again, all organisms die. And when organisms die, other organisms come by and mineralize the nitrogen in their tissues. And by mineralization, this is kind of a strange turn of phrase, but by nitrogen mineralization, we mean the conversion of organic forms of nitrogen back to ammonium, so back to inorganic forms of nitrogen. And this is performed by decomposing microorganisms. So this is, again, just organic nitrogen being turned into ammonium. And this is kind of the first turn of the cycle that you see. You had nitrogen fixed and then assimilated into tissues. Those tissues die. That nitrogen is mineralized, returned to the soil, where it can then be assimilated again, and the cycle continues. But when will mineralization occur? So mineralization is the byproduct of decomposition. So a decomposing microbe will take up some organic carbon from some dead organism, and that organic carbon molecule also contains organic nitrogen. And it will break down the molecule in order to produce energy and also gain the elements that are inside that organic molecule. So maybe there's nitrogen, maybe there's phosphorus, maybe there's sulfur. It will incorporate those elements, if it needs it, into their tissues. And you only have release of nitrogen if there's more nitrogen in that molecule than is necessary for that microbe to grow and reproduce. So nitrogen is a waste product of decomposition if there's too much of it. And that is when you see mineralization. So say in terms of carbon and nitrogen, if the carbon to nitrogen ratio or the phosphorus to nitrogen ratio in soil is higher than what the microbial stoichiometry demands, so if there's more carbon and there's more phosphorus in the soil than there is nitrogen, then microbes are going to really strongly retain that nitrogen because they have abundance of everything else that they need to grow. And so that nitrogen is the limiting element for their growth. And so as a result, if your carbon to nitrogen and your phosphorus to nitrogen ratios are high in the soil, you will have no mineralization. You'll have no release of nitrogen because nitrogen isn't a waste product of metabolism. It's a vitally important element that microbe needs to grow and reproduce. It's only when you have an abundance of nitrogen in the tissues that a microbe is decomposing that it will release nitrogen, because that nitrogen is then in excess of its biological demand, and thus it's essentially a waste product. So it excretes ammonia as a waste product of its metabolism. Only when your carbon to nitrogen ratio is low, because that's when it has excess nitrogen. So this is what governs mineralization. Mineralization rates are primarily determined by the stoichiometry of the stuff that's being decomposed relative to the stoichiometry of the decomposing organisms. And so now we've touched a bit on this mineralization step. This is where this loop completes. You have decomposers that decompose organic matter that contains carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, all sorts of elements. And if there's extra nitrogen in that material that the organism can't use, it excretes it into this ammonium pool, and thus the cycle repeats itself. This ammonium is then available for plant uptake, for uptake by other microorganisms, et cetera, et cetera. So from fixation to assimilation to mineralization again completes a loop. But there's also another off-ramp shown here, which is the process of nitrification, which is just kind of a detour on the nitrogen cycle. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So nitrification is a process by which one inorganic form of nitrogen, namely ammonium, is converted into nitrite and nitrate by microbes. And this is an energy-yielding reaction that microbes use to gain energy. So you have ammonium plus oxygen. The ammonium is oxidized to nitrite, and it produces protons and some water along the way too. And so you notice this involves oxygen. This is an aerobic process. And again, it's an energy-yielding process that certain microbes, namely nitrifiers, use to gain energy from the system. It's interesting because this gain of energy actually doesn't involve any organic carbon. It's a chemotrophic metabolism that these microbes have. So why is nitrification important? Why does a plant care if nitrogen is in the form of ammonium or nitrate or nitrite? The answer is plants don't really care all that much. Most organisms don't really care too much what form their inorganic nitrogen is coming into their tissues by. But nitrification is a key step for the loss of nitrogen from terrestrial systems via water. And we've mentioned this briefly in the past, but the reason for this is that ammonium has a positive charge. Ammonium can adsorb to the cation exchange complex in the soil, and thus ammonium is sticky. It's only when nitrification occurs and that the nitrogen goes from being positively charged to being negatively charged that the cation exchange complex can no longer retain nitrogen. And so as a result, in agricultural systems, for example, you have huge outflows of nitrate but very little flow of ammonium from a system. So here is an average of nitrogen in surface waters in Minnesota in its various forms. And you can see here that this blue bar right here, nitrate, is the dominant form of nitrogen that leaves terrestrial ecosystems and enters freshwater systems in Minnesota, as in most places. You have very, very little ammonium and ammonia shown in these bars here, and you have some organic nitrogen. You know, organic nitrogen leaves as dissolved organic matter as well. But really important to notice, nitrate is the dominant flux of nitrogen from the ecosystem. In places that aren't as well fertilized as Minnesota, Minnesota is a very well fertilized place, this organic nitrogen term will become comparatively more important. But in many to most places around the world, you have nitrate being the dominant form of nutrient loss from terrestrial ecosystems. So that's why nitrification is so central to the nitrogen cycle. So we've discussed one loss term of nitrogen from terrestrial ecosystems, namely leaching. And now I want to discuss the other major loss component of the nitrogen cycle, and that's denitrification. Denitrification is the conversion of nitrate, NO3-, to gaseous forms, so completing the entire nitrogen cycle, returning fixed nitrogen to the atmosphere as dinitrogen gas, or in some cases as nitrous oxide. And this only occurs in anaerobic conditions. You'll recall that this is a redox reaction. Microbes respire organic carbon, and then they have to shunt those electrons somewhere. They normally would shunt it to oxygen if oxygen's around, but in the absence of oxygen, they use nitrate as an alternative electron acceptor. So you have nitrate plus electrons plus hydrogens yields dinitrogen gas and water. This is just a classic reduction half-cell reaction. Or in this incomplete form of denitrification, which some microbes are only capable of doing, you have the conversion of nitrate into nitrous oxide plus water. So microbes do this in order to be able to respire carbon in the lack of oxygen in an anoxic environment in order to gain energy. They use nitrate as an alternative electron acceptor. And this is a major source of loss of nitrogen in ecosystems. It only, again, occurs in anaerobic conditions. And so you'll find this often happening in flooded soils, in sediments in lakes and places that don't have a lot of oxygen exchange with the atmosphere. But it can also happen in well-oxygenated soils. And the kind of place that this happens in well-oxygenated soils is on the inside of soil aggregates, or like clumps of soils. Clumps of soils will have kind of a gradient of oxygen from the surface into the center of the soil. And in the center of the soil, we'll have depletion of oxygen because there's less oxygen transfer in that aggregate, whereas the outside of the soil will be oxic. So even if your total soil is kind of well oxygenated, you'll still have little sites within soils where denitrification will occur as a result of the lack of oxygen on the interior of soil aggregates. So again, this is a major loss term for nitrogen. So if we kind of take a look at this broad nitrogen cycle again. Again, we have kind of this internal biological cycling going on: assimilation, mineralization, nitrification, more assimilation, round and round. And we have this kind of off-ramp here by which denitrifiers return nitrogen to the atmosphere and begin the whole nitrogen cycle over again. And like I said, this is something that humans want to promote often. You'll notice kind of the pinkish cast in this tank here. That's a surefire sign of denitrification. If you also go to like a hog farm and see a disgusting hog lagoon, you'll often notice that these hog lagoons are bright pink. And that's because these hog lagoons are being managed to remove nitrogen pollution so that that farmer can then dispose of their wastewater without polluting their waterways with nitrogen. So yeah, denitrification is often a good thing that we're trying to promote, but it has some knock-on bad effects sometimes. And the main bad effect that I want to bring attention to is this incomplete denitrification reaction that I sort of glossed over on the other slide, which is the conversion of nitrate reduced to nitrous oxide plus water. And nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas. It is also an ozone depleter. It also contributes to smog in the troposphere. So this is actually quite a problematic gas. It's not just all fun and games at your dentist's office. And so you can see throughout time, nitrous oxide has been going through the roof. This is the nitrous oxide concentration in 1750, and it has increased by about 10%, I believe, since that time. And it was even lower back in prehistory, of course. And the reason for this is primarily that we are, of course, pumping tons and tons and tons of nitrogen into the ecosystem by the Haber-Bosch process. And simply more nitrogen, more biologically available nitrogen, means more nitrous oxide production by this reaction. So this is entirely caused by humans. It was, in hindsight, it's entirely predictable. As everything is in hindsight. But this is a major problem that we're really concerned about. Nitrous oxide is only third to methane and carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And so this is a major climate contributor, a major contributor to climate change that is causing a lot of worry. And there's a lot of research and effort done into what drives this incomplete denitrification reaction, where you produce nitrous oxide, versus complete denitrification, where you produce nitrogen gas. So just let's step back and take a broad view again at the entirety of the nitrogen cycle and kind of just assimilate what we've learned in this lesson today. All nitrogen starts off in the atmosphere as N2 gas. And this nitrogen is unavailable to biota. It's basically inert. And it's only through the process of nitrogen fixation that nitrogen becomes biologically available. Nitrogen fixation is done by microbes. It's done by lightning a little bit. And it's increasingly, and very importantly, now done by humans through the Haber-Bosch process. So nitrogen fixation is the process by which you increase the biologically available forms of nitrogen in an ecosystem, and fixation produces ammonium. And this ammonium can then be assimilated by plants or by other microbes living in the soil after fixation occurs. And as this nitrogen is assimilated by plants and microbes, when those plants and microbes die, that nitrogen can then be remineralized. Nitrogen mineralization is called ammonification on this figure, but we also refer to it as mineralization, will return that organic nitrogen to the soil as inorganic ammonium. Now there's also this other kind of wider loop in this biological nitrogen cycle, where instead of immediate reassimilation of ammonia, you have the production of nitrate, and then nitrate is then reassimilated. And the extent to which this mineralization and this nitrification will occur is primarily driven by the stoichiometry of microbes that are doing the decomposition. If there's an excess of nitrogen, they'll release nitrogen as a waste product, and you'll have higher inorganic nitrogen concentrations in your soil that are available to be assimilated. If nitrogen is lacking in your system, those microbes are going to strongly retain nitrogen and not release it into the soil, and your plants will suffer as a result. This causes nitrogen deficiency in soils. So here's kind of your inner loop of the nitrogen cycle and your outer loop of the nitrogen cycle for the biological nitrogen cycle that's happening in soils. And like I said, there are kind of two off-ramps to this biological nitrogen cycle. The first off-ramp is through leaching. When you produce nitrate in the soils, this nitrate is not very well retained in soils, and so water can just flush it out of soils. And so you have loss of nitrogen in terrestrial ecosystems into aquatic ecosystems. The second form of loss is this permanent loss, denitrification here, which kind of completes the grand nitrogen cycle, this huge, the huge outermost beltway of this nitrogen cycle. Denitrification returns nitrate to the atmosphere as nitrogen gas and sometimes as nitrous oxide, thus completing the loop and making this a cycle and not just a dead end. So one way in, fixation. A lot of ways it can cycle around while it's in the biological nitrogen cycle. And then two ways out of the biological cycle, either through leaching or through denitrification. That's all I have for you. Next time we're going to discuss phosphorus dynamics in terrestrial ecosystems, which I promise you is an easier subject than the nitrogen cycle. A little bit more boring, but much easier. And then we're going to talk about what happens when these nutrients leach out of terrestrial ecosystems into freshwaters, all the problems this can cause, and how nutrient dynamics change when you move from land-based systems into aquatic systems. So I'll see you then.